She was 17 years old when the world decided she had no place left in it, standing alone on the edge of Black Marsh Harbor with salt cutting her lips and a single small satchel pressed against her ribs. It was Captain Elias Crow, her late father's employer and the man who once promised protection, who cast her out after the dockyard collapse was blamed on her father's final inspection notes. In her pocket was all she had left in the world, $12.40 in worn banknotes, enough to buy nothing in a town that had already erased her name. And yet, against every sensible warning, she used it to purchase something no one else would touch. A crumbling lighthouse on the jagged coast of Alderroe Point, sold for the price of unpaid taxes and a broken chain of ownership no one wanted to untangle. The townsfolk called it a death sentence wrapped in stone. They said it leaned like a tired man waiting to fall into the sea. But inside its sealed lantern-room safe, hidden behind rusted iron and forgotten glass, something waited. Ship logs that should not have survived, records that could rewrite the fate of wrecks the ocean had already claimed, and perhaps even restore a broken coast that had learned to live only with loss. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elira Venn. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. Elira Venn had not always belonged to silence. Before Black Marsh Harbor turned its back on her, she had lived in the narrow wooden house above the cooper's yard, where her father, Thomas Venn, spent his days repairing barrels for ships that never seemed to return empty. She grew up learning the language of timber and tide, how it spoke differently when it was dry, when it was soaked, when it had carried salt water too long. Her mother, Merelda, had been a schoolteacher before the fever took her, and from her Elira inherited the careful patience of reading things twice, once for what they said and once for what they hid. By the time she was 12, Elira could read shipping manifests faster than most clerks twice her age. She could trace a cargo's journey from ink smudges alone, knowing when a ship had lingered too long in storm waters or when a captain had quietly changed course. It was not a skill anyone in Black Marsh thought important for a girl, but her father had once said that the sea never wasted information, only men wasted their attention. The harbor itself was a hard teacher. Black Marsh was carved between cliffs that never softened, its waters dark even in daylight, as though the ocean had learned to keep secrets there. Ships came in fewer each year, and those that did often left lighter than they arrived, as if the sea had taken payment in unseen currency. Still, Elira loved it. She loved the groaning ropes, the gulls that sounded like distant arguments, the lanterns that swayed like tired stars at dusk. Captain Elias Crow changed that balance. He was a man of polished boots and controlled smiles, who arrived in Black Marsh with promises of rebuilding trade routes and restoring the harbor's reputation. He hired Thomas Venn as chief inspection officer for incoming cargo ships, trusting his reputation for honesty. For a time, it seemed like the harbor might breathe again. Elira remembered those months as thin but bright. She would sit on the pier steps in the evenings, watching her father and Crow walk the docks, speaking in low tones about tonnage and tide patterns, about ships that never made it to ledger books. There was something uneasy in Crow's eyes, something that never settled, but Elira was too young to name it then. The first fracture came slowly. A shipment from the north, timber and iron rods, was recorded as safe by the harbor office, but Thomas insisted on a second inspection. He found structural weaknesses in the crates, subtle but deliberate, as though someone had intended them to fail under stress. He reported it. The cargo was delayed. Crow smiled too calmly afterward. 2 weeks later, the western pier collapsed during loading. No one died, but the blame needed a shape, and Black Marsh had always preferred simple stories. Thomas Venn became that shape. Crow produced inspection documents bearing his signature. The Harbor Council, eager to preserve trade relations, accepted them without question. Elira remembered the night her father came home silent, placing his inspection tools on the table as though returning borrowed time. He never defended himself in the way the town expected. Instead, he spent his final days rereading old ship log from the Lighthouse archives at Alderroe Point, whispering that something in the sea did not match what men claimed to record. Then one morning, he did not wake. The fall that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative. Elira and her father's name were removed from harbor records. Their house was claimed under unpaid obligations tied to the dockyard investigation. Crow himself did not visit. He did not need to. His absence carried more authority than presence ever could. At 17, Elira stood outside the Cooper's yard with her satchel and $12.40, watching strangers load her life into someone else's cart. No one met her eyes. In Black Marsh Harbor, truth was expensive, and she no longer had currency. She walked until the cliffs began. Alderò Point had always been spoken of in warnings. The lighthouse there had guided ships for nearly 70 years before its keeper vanished during a winter storm that left no wreckage, only silence. After that, the light was never properly maintained again. Ships began avoiding the coast entirely, and eventually, the lighthouse was decommissioned. It remained, though, stone, iron, and glass slowly surrendering to weather. The auction notice had been pinned to the harbor board for months, ignored like a bad omen. Abandoned property. Structural decay. Buyer assumes all liability. Minimum bid, $10. Elira had stood before it for a long time. People laughed when she went to the clerk. A girl buying a dying lighthouse was either a joke or a confession of despair. The clerk, bored and sunburnt, accepted her coins without ceremony. There was no celebration, no signature of triumph. Just a transaction that felt like disappearing. The walk to Alderò Point took her 2 days. When she finally saw it, the lighthouse leaned slightly inland, as though resisting the sea's attempt to reclaim it. Waves struck the rocks below with patient violence, and the wind carried a sound like distant breathing. The door was not locked, only tired. Inside, the air smelled of iron, old oil, and forgotten weather. Elira climbed the spiral stairs in darkness, counting each step as if it might change. Halfway up, she found names carved into the stone. Keepers long gone, initials fading into salt-stained rock. At the top waited the lantern room. The glass was cracked but intact. The great brass lamp hung like a hollowed sun. And behind it, partially concealed in the wall, she found a heavy iron safe. It was not meant to be found. That night, she slept on the floor beneath the lantern room, listening to the wind argue with the sea. And somewhere in that noise, something inside the lighthouse seemed to wait for her to decide whether she belonged there. The next morning, she found the first key. It was wedged beneath a loose brick near the stairwell, wrapped in oilcloth. Small, blackened with age, marked with a symbol she did not recognize. A circle intersected by 3 lines, like a compass that had lost its way but still remembered direction. Inside the safe, there would be more than rust. But she did not yet know that the lighthouse had not been abandoned. It had been sealed, and what was sealed had once been recorded by men who never returned from sea. Elira opened the oilcloth slowly, as though the act itself might summon consequences. The key inside was cold despite the warmth of her hands, its teeth unusually fine, almost delicate. She held it up toward the fractured lantern glass, watching light scatter through it like broken memory. The safe did not open that day, but something else changed. That evening, as the tide pulled back further than it should have, exposing black ribs of stone usually hidden beneath water, Elira noticed markings along the inner wall of the lantern room. Not carved, but burned, faint lines and numbers etched into metal as if by heat rather than tool. They formed sequences, dates, coordinates, and ship names. At first glance, it looked like nonsense. But Elira had been raised by ledgers and tides. It was a record, not of light, of passage. Each marking corresponded to a ship that had passed Alderò Point over decades. Ships that, according to official harbor records, had never made landfall again. Her breath caught when she recognized one name. The Merrow's Grace, a trading vessel listed as lost in calm waters 3 years before her father's death. She remembered Tomas Vin speaking of it once, insisting the weather had been clear, the sea too still for disappearance. Elira spent the night tracing the markings, copying them into her satchel journal with shaking precision. The lighthouse was no longer empty. It was speaking in fragments. On the 3rd day, she found a second clue. It came from the lantern mechanism itself. While inspecting the gears beneath the brass housing, she discovered a narrow compartment sealed behind a false plate. Inside lay a bundle of ship logs, tightly bound in oilskin, preserved against moisture and time in a way that defied the lighthouse's abandonment. The handwriting inside was consistent across multiple entries, tight, disciplined, belonging to a keeper named Orrin Hale, the last recorded lighthouse master before the disappearance. The logs did not describe storms or wrecks. They described patterns. Ships entering certain waters vanished only when passing under specific tidal alignments. Cargo records mismatched arrival reports in ways too precise to be coincidence. And most disturbingly, Orrin Hale wrote of observing ships reappearing months later under different names, their crews claiming ignorance of prior voyages. As Alira read, the lighthouse seemed to shift around her, not physically, but perceptibly, as though it had been waiting for someone capable of understanding what it had been storing. The logs ended abruptly on a page dated the winter of the keeper's disappearance. There was a final note. If anyone finds this, do not trust the light. It does not guide. It records. That night, Alira saw a ship. It should not have been there. No vessel approached Aldero Point after dusk. Yet from the lantern room, she saw a faint silhouette cutting through mist beyond the rocks, moving without sound, as though carried more by memory than water. No lanterns burned aboard it. No signal flags. Just presence. And as it passed, the lighthouse's brass mechanism clicked once, automatically, as if registering entry. The safe had not yet been opened, but something inside it had already begun to respond. Alira realized then that the lighthouse was not merely abandoned. It was operational in a way no official record acknowledged. And someone, somewhere, had built it to keep counting things the sea was never meant to return. She returned to the logs, reading them again, slower now. Between entries, she began noticing references to a ledger kept not in the lighthouse, but beneath it, accessible only during lowest tide through a maintenance tunnel long sealed by stone collapse. Orrin Hale had written of a vault of passage records, containing full manifests of ships tracked through Aldero's waters, even those erased from harbor documentation. Alira felt something tighten in her chest as she understood the implication. Her father had been right. The records did not match reality because reality had been altered, and somewhere beneath the lighthouse, truth had been stored like contraband. She looked again at the iron safe, and this time she understood why it had been placed at eye level, not hidden deeper. It was not meant to protect what was inside. It was meant to make her open it when she was ready to understand what it meant. And in the distance, the sea continued its patient work against the shore, as though waiting for her next decision. Alira did not open the safe that night. Instead, she sat beside it as the wind pressed itself against the lantern glass and the lighthouse groaned in its old joints, as though remembering a language it had not spoken in years. The logs lay open beside her, weighted by a stone she had taken from the stairwell, their pages shifting slightly whenever the wind changed direction. She read them again and again until the words stopped feeling like text and began to feel like patterns, rhythms the sea itself had been trained to follow. The next morning came without softness. Mist clung low to Aldero Point, thick enough that the world beyond the lighthouse dissolved into white uncertainty. Alira descended the spiral stairs slowly, pausing at each carved name in the stone, as though asking silent permission from those who had once stood where she now stood. At the base of the lighthouse, where the structure met rock, she found something she had missed before, a seam in the stonework, nearly invisible, running along the edge where tidewater occasionally reached during storms. It was not natural wear. It was deliberate sealing. She pressed her fingers against it, feeling coldness deeper than the weather should allow, and realized the lighthouse had been closed off not only above but below. That was when she saw him. A man stood near the rocks at a distance that made him difficult to define clearly, as though the mist refused to fully agree on his shape. He wore a weathered coat and carried no lantern, yet moved with certainty across terrain that should have demanded caution. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply watched the lighthouse. And then, without warning, he turned and began walking toward it. Elira stepped back instinctively, her hand tightening around the key she had found days earlier. By the time she reached the lantern stairs again, the man was already at the base of the lighthouse, looking up. When he spoke, his voice carried upward in fragments, shaped by wind and stone. "You've opened the records," he said. It was not a question. Elira did not answer immediately. Something in his tone carried familiarity she could not place, like a memory that had forgotten its owner. "I didn't open anything yet," she replied carefully. The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a technical distinction that still changed nothing. "You will," he said, "or you wouldn't be here." He introduced himself as Merrick Hallow, though he did not offer where he came from, only that he had once worked along the northern shipping routes, charting vessels that passed Aldero Point before disappearing from official logs. Elira watched him carefully. Men did not come to the lighthouse unless they had reasons the sea would later refuse to repeat. "You shouldn't be here," she said. A faint, tired expression crossed his face. "No," Merrick agreed, "but neither should you. And yet here we are." He asked her what she had seen in the lantern room. She told him nothing at first. Then, against better judgment, she showed him the ship logs. He read them in silence that felt heavier than speech. When he reached the mention of Orrin Hale, his fingers paused slightly longer than necessary. "I thought this record was lost," he said quietly. That sentence changed the air. Elira studied him more closely. "You knew him?" Merrick did not answer directly. Instead, he looked out toward the sea and said, "I knew what he was trying to stop." He explained, slowly, that Aldero Point was not merely a lighthouse in the traditional sense. It had once been part of a larger system, an unofficial network of maritime tracking stations built during a period when trade disputes between coastal territories had grown unstable. Official records spoke of navigation aid, but Merrick spoke of something more deliberate, interception of truth. Ships did not only pass through Aldero waters. They were recorded, compared, and sometimes altered in documentation depending on who controlled the narrative of trade. Elira listened with tightening disbelief. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "It doesn't have to," Merrick replied. "It only has to be useful to the people who built it." He stepped closer to the lighthouse wall, placing his hand against the same seam Elira had discovered earlier. "This leads down," he said, "to the original keeper's vault." Elira felt a cold awareness settle in her chest. "And what's inside?" she asked. Marek hesitated. "Proof," he said finally, "of every ship that never returned officially, but did return physically, and what they carried back instead of cargo." That night, they prepared to open the lower passage. The tide mattered. Merrick explained that the vault entrance only became accessible during the lowest lunar tide cycle, when the sea pulled back far enough to expose the stone throat beneath the lighthouse foundation. Elira watched the water all evening, noting how it receded not naturally, but almost as if it obeyed a schedule. When the moment came, they descended together. The passage was narrower than expected, carved into rock rather than built, as though the lighthouse had been placed over something older rather than constructed alone. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the scent of iron and salt that felt less like environment and more like preservation. At the end of the tunnel stood a sealed door reinforced with rusted metal bands. Unlike the lighthouse safe above, this one bore no external keyhole, only a handprint indentation. Elira hesitated. Merrick looked at her once. "It recognizes the keeper's line," he said. "My father was not a keeper," she replied. Marek's silence was answer enough that there was more to that statement than she had been told. Elira placed her hand against the indentation anyway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the metal warmed. A mechanism deeper within the stone shifted, slow and reluctant, as though something had been asleep for a long time and was uncertain whether waking was permitted. The door opened. Inside, the vault was not a treasure chamber. It was a library of maritime truth. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bound ship manifests, sealed logbooks, and ledger scrolls marked with the same symbol Elira had seen on the key. In the center stood a large table covered in ink-stained maps, each one marked with routes that contradicted official navigation charts. Merrick moved through the space carefully, like a man entering a place he had once been forbidden from remembering. Elira picked up a logbook at random. The entry inside described a ship that had been officially declared lost in a storm near calm waters. But the vault record showed it had instead been redirected through Aldero Passage, its cargo quietly reassigned under new ownership upon return. Another book described similar patterns. And another. And another. The scale was not isolated error. It was systematic rewriting. Elira's hands began to tremble as she understood the implications spreading across decades of entries. "This isn't about navigation," she said quietly. Marek nodded. "No," he said. "It's about ownership." A sound echoed faintly from above, the lighthouse shifting under wind pressure. But beneath it, something else felt present. Not movement, but awareness. As though the vault itself understood, it was being read again. Then Elira found the final ledger. Unlike the others, it was locked, not with metal, but with classification marks burned into its cover. Merrick did not touch it. He stepped back slightly. "That one," he said, "is why Orrin Hale disappeared." Elira opened it anyway. Inside were names she recognized. Harbor officials, trade captains, and one entry that made her breath stop entirely. Tomas Sven, her father's name. She stared at it, unable to move, as the pages explained what the others had only hinted at. Her father had not been a victim of false records. He had been part of the verification system that confirmed them. But the final entries did not describe betrayal in simple terms. They described disagreement, refusal, a decision to halt a falsification cycle that had been running for years through Aldero Point's recording system. And then silence. Elira closed the book slowly. The world felt different now, as though it had been reassembled incorrectly and she had just noticed the misalignment. Merrick spoke softly behind her. "He tried to stop it," he said. "That's why Crow removed him." Elira did not respond immediately. The truth was not clean enough to hold easily. It fractured everything it touched. Above them, the lighthouse lantern suddenly flickered. And for the first time since she had arrived, Elira understood the safe upstairs was not a beginning. It was the continuation of what had already been started long before she was born. Elira did not speak for a long time after reading her father's name. The vault seemed to tighten around her silence, as though the stone itself was waiting to see what kind of person she would become once the truth finished settling into her bones. Merrick remained at a careful distance, neither interrupting nor leaving, watching her with the quiet patience of someone who had seen many people arrive at similar edges and either step forward or break. Finally, Elira closed the ledger, not because she was finished with it, but because she could no longer trust her own hands to hold it steady. "If my father was part of this," she said at last, her voice low, "then why is he written like a warning?" Marek exhaled slowly. "Because he changed." The answer did not satisfy her. It was not meant to. He explained that the system beneath Aldero Point was never stable. It required constant confirmation from men who believed they were recording truth, when in reality they were maintaining a version of it. Tomas Sven, according to the later entries, had begun questioning inconsistencies in ship returns, ships that reappeared with altered cargo declarations, altered crew manifests, altered ownership. The more he investigated, the more he disrupted the balance, and the more dangerous he became to those who depended on that balance remaining invisible. Elira stepped away from the table, moving slowly between shelves filled with sealed histories. Each one represented a ship, a voyage, a disappearance that was not disappearance at all, but reassignment. It was like standing inside a memory that had been edited too many times, leaving only traces of what had once been whole. Then she found something that changed the air again. A smaller chest, tucked beneath the farthest shelf, marked not with the system symbol, but with a personal engraving, OH. Ordenhade. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside were not logs, but correspondence. Letters written in a hurried, uneven hand. The final one was never sent. Merrick recognized it immediately. That's his private record. Elira read. Orrin Hale wrote of a decision made above his authority. That ships were no longer merely being tracked. They were being redirected in record after passing Aldero Point. Entire cargoes reassigned on paper, while vessels themselves continued unknowingly under altered ownership chains. But the most disturbing part was not the manipulation itself. It was its purpose. The system was not built for profit alone. It was built to erase accountability for loss. If a ship disappeared, no one was responsible. If it returned under a different registry, no one could claim theft. The sea became the scapegoat for every administrative correction, and Aldero Point was the instrument that made it believable. Elira lowered the letter slowly. "So my father," she began. Merrick did not let her finish the sentence. Was trying to shut it down. A distant rumble passed through the vault's ceiling, like the lighthouse shifting its weight above them. The sound was subtle, but both of them felt it. Something had changed upstairs. Elira looked upward instinctively. "The safe," she said. Merrick nodded once. "It's reacting." They climbed back through the passage in silence, urgency replacing caution. The tunnel felt shorter on the return, as though the lighthouse itself no longer wanted them below. When they reached the lantern room, the air had changed. The brass safe was no longer inert. It vibrated faintly, not with mechanical force, but with something closer to recognition. The symbol engraved into its surface, the same one on the key, seemed darker, more defined, as though newly awakened. Elira stepped toward it. Merrick stopped her lightly. "It only opens for registered clearance." She turned to him. "And what does that mean?" He hesitated. Someone who was part of the system. A long silence followed. Then Elira placed her hand on the safe. Nothing happened at first. The lighthouse wind pressed harder against the glass, and the lantern room creaked like something uneasy. Merrick watched carefully, as though expecting rejection. Then the safe clicked. Once, then again, and slowly, reluctantly, it opened. Inside was not gold, nor relics, nor anything immediately recognizable as treasure. It was records, but different from those below. These were original manifests, uncorrected, unedited, untouched by the system that Merrick had described. Ship logs with entries that did not match official histories, names of captains whose vessels had supposedly vanished, cargo descriptions that contradicted every public record Elira had ever seen. And at the bottom of the safe, sealed in wax, was a final ledger marked in her father's handwriting. Elira's breath caught before she even touched it. Merrick stepped back slightly, giving her space that felt heavier than proximity. She broke the seal. The pages inside were written not as accusation, but as confession. Tomas Venn had discovered that Aldero Point was not only recording maritime movement, it was participating in its reclassification. Ships were being rerouted physically through unofficial channels and then reassigned in records to conceal illegal trade agreements between harbor authorities and private shipping coalitions. The Lighthouse was the verification node. It confirmed what was real and what could be rewritten. But Tomas had found something deeper. A hidden pattern in the system that showed certain ships were not merely being reassigned. They were being deliberately removed from circulation under false loss reports to clear ownership disputes or insurance claims. And worse, he had discovered that Captain Elias Crow was one of the primary architects maintaining the system's operational silence. Elira's hands tightened around the ledger. Everything she had been told about her father's disgrace shifted under this new weight. He had not been careless. He had been targeted for interruption. But the final pages contained something unexpected. A map, not of land or sea routes, but of the system itself, marking points of correction, nodes of interference, and one central directive labeled simply, Crow Authority Seal. Elira looked at Merrick. "This is not just a record system," she said quietly. Merrick nodded once. "It's controlled truth." Outside, the sea struck the rocks harder. And for the first time since Elira arrived at the lighthouse, she understood the scale of what she was standing inside. It was not an abandoned structure. It was an instrument still in use. And somewhere in Black Marsh Harbor, the man who had destroyed her life still believed it was functioning exactly as intended. Elira stood in the lantern room with the open safe still hanging like a wound in the wall, its contents spread carefully across the old wooden table. The wind outside pressed harder now, as though the coast itself had become aware of what had been uncovered and no longer knew how to remain indifferent. Merrick watched her without speaking. There was a shift in him too now. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that comes when a buried system is finally seen clearly enough that denial is no longer possible. Elira ran her fingers over the final map again, the one marked with her father's handwriting, the one that pointed not just to corruption, but to structure, an entire architecture of altered truth maintained through Aldero Point like a hidden spine beneath maritime history. If this is still active, she said quietly, then every ship passing through Black Marsh is still being rewritten. Merrick nodded once. Not just Black Marsh. Every harbor that depends on the chain. That sentence changed the air again. It widened the story beyond anything personal. Beyond her father. Beyond Crow. Beyond even Aldero Point. Elira looked out through the cracked lantern glass. Far in the distance, the sea line shimmered faintly, as though carrying invisible traffic. And no one knows, she said. They're not meant to, Merrick replied. A long silence followed, thick enough that even the lighthouse seemed to lean inward to listen. Elira turned back to the safe. Inside its frame, there was one final compartment she had not yet opened, smaller than the others, hidden behind a false brass lining. It required not the key, not the handprint, but alignment. 3 gears that only turned when the lantern mechanism above was engaged. Merrick noticed it first. That's not a storage compartment, he said slowly. That's control access. Elira moved without answering. She climbed the narrow steps to the lantern mechanism. The brass gears were cold, but not lifeless. When she touched them, she felt resistance. Not mechanical, but almost intentional, as though the system recognized her but had not yet decided whether to obey. She turned the first gear. A sound echoed through the lighthouse. Not from one place, but everywhere at once. The structure responding like a living memory being disturbed. Below, Merrick called up, careful. If that engages the full registry node. He stopped, because something had already begun. Elira turned the second gear. The lantern room brightened faintly, even though no flame had been lit. The glass panels along the tower flickered with reflected light that did not match the sky. And then the third gear clicked into place. The lighthouse changed. Not visibly at first, but structurally, like a system unlocking an internal awareness. Somewhere beneath them, deep within the stone and sea-worn foundations, something older than the lighthouse itself responded. Elira descended slowly. When she reached the table again, the final compartment in the safe was open. Inside was a single brass plate and a registry seal stamped with the authority mark of Black Marsh Harbor Council. But beneath it, written in thin ink, was something that made her pause completely. Aldero Point is not a witness structure. It is an active correction engine. All records passing through it are eligible for revision under Crow authorization. Merrick read it over her shoulder. His expression tightened. So it was never passive, he said. It was being used. Elira's voice was barely audible. Used for what? Merrick hesitated before answering. Control of loss. The phrase hung in the air like something too heavy to fully settle. Elira finally understood the true shape of it. Ships did not disappear by accident. They were removed from accountability. Families were told stories that matched paperwork instead of reality. And her father had tried to stop the system from erasing people without consequence. A sudden sound cut through the lighthouse. Footsteps. Not inside. Outside. On the rocks. Elira moved to the lantern glass immediately. Below, through shifting mist, lantern lights were approaching from the harbor side. Multiple. Controlled. Coordinated. Merrick saw them too. They've noticed the activation, he said quietly. Elira did not look away. Crow. Merrick did not answer immediately. Then, he wouldn't come himself unless the system was unstable. The lights drew closer. The sea wind shifted. And the lighthouse, for the first time since Elira arrived, felt exposed. They'll shut it down, Merrick said, and everything inside it with it. Elira turned slowly back toward the safe. then to the logs, then to the lantern mechanism above. No, she said quietly. Madik frowned. No. Elira closed the ledger. They've been using it quietly, she said. So it can only be stopped loudly. A long pause. Then she made her decision. Not to destroy the lighthouse, but to turn it outward. If it was truly a correction engine, then it did not only store truth, it could project it, record it, release it. She moved to the lantern controls again. Merrick stepped forward. Elira, if you trigger full release, you'll expose every rewritten record, every harbor agreement, every ship reassigned. It won't just clear your father's name. It will collapse trade routes, insurance claims, entire coastal economies. Her hand paused on the brass gear. For the first time, she understood the weight of what she had inherited. Not property, not ruin, but responsibility. Outside, the lantern lights were now visible through the fog, close enough that voices could almost be imagined below them. Merrick said quietly, "There has to be another way." Elira looked out one more time at Aldero Point, at the sea that had carried so many silent revisions, at the lighthouse that had counted them all. Then she said, very softly, "There is, but it won't protect the lie anymore." And she turned the mechanism fully. The lighthouse did not explode. It did not break. It opened. A pulse of light moved through the lantern system, not outward like a beam, but inward like a reversal. Every hidden log, every sealed record, every altered manifest stored within Aldero Point began to surface, not as paper, but as signal. The lantern room filled with layered projections of ships long declared lost, now shown in their true routes. Below, Merrick stepped back in disbelief. Outside, the approaching harbor lights stopped, and for the first time in decades, Black Marsh Harbor received something it had never been designed to withstand. Unedited truth. The sea went strangely quiet. The silence that followed the lighthouse activation was not empty. It was full in a way sound could never be. Even the sea seemed to hesitate, as though the tide itself had been asked to account for itself. Inside the lantern room, the air shimmered with drifting overlays of light, ghosted ship routes, corrected manifests, names reappearing where they had been erased for years. Elira stood still at the control gear, her hand still resting where she had turned it, feeling the faint vibration of something no longer contained. Merrick was the first to speak. "You've opened the full archive feed," he said quietly, almost disbelieving. "It's not just local records anymore. It's the entire chain." Elira did not answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on one projection that kept repeating more than the others. A ship-marked VIN inspection log, final override entry. Her father's handwriting flickered in and out of visibility, like the system itself was unsure whether it was allowed to remember him. Then came a sound from below. Not footsteps this time. Voices, rising from the rocks around the lighthouse. The harbor delegation had arrived. Through the mist, lanterns formed a tightening ring at Aldero Point's base. Men moving carefully across wet stone, their silhouettes fractured by fog and shifting light. At their center was Captain Elias Crow. He did not shout. He did not need to. His presence carried the weight of someone who had always expected obedience from the world. Elira Vin. His voice called upward, calm but sharpened at the edges. Step away from the mechanism. Merrick moved instinctively toward the stairwell, but Elira raised a hand slightly. Not to stop him from fear, but from interruption. Crow continued. "You are interfering with a sealed maritime correction system. You do not understand what you have activated." Elira looked down through the lantern glass. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way she did not feel. "I understand that you erased ships," she said, "and people believe the sea did it for you." A pause. Even from above, she could feel the shift in him. The smallest disturbance in a man used to never being questioned in open air. "That system maintains stability," Crow replied. "Without it, trade collapses. Insurance fails. Ports go to war over uncertainty." Merrick muttered under his breath. So it was always justification. Elira ignored him, still focused downward. "You blame my father," she said. Crow did not deny it. He understood what was necessary, Crow said instead, until he stopped understanding it. The wind sharpened. The lighthouse lantern flickered again, reacting to emotional load in the system below like a pressure gauge. Then Merrick stepped forward. "Crow," he called down. "The full archive is live. You can't suppress it anymore." For the first time, Crow looked unsettled. Not afraid, but calculating. Because he understood something Alira was only now beginning to grasp. The lighthouse was no longer a passive record structure. It was broadcasting. Every ship correction, every falsified disappearance, every rewritten ownership chain was now becoming visible across connected harbor stations. Crow raised a hand, not in surrender, in command. "Cut the lantern," he ordered sharply. Behind him, technicians moved immediately toward the base access panel. Alira saw it at the same time Merrick did. "They're going to physically sever the relay line," Merrick said quickly. "If they do that mid-release, the system will fragment. Some records will remain corrupted forever." Alira turned toward the mechanism again. The lantern system pulsed, stronger now, unstable under interference. Inside the projections, she saw something new forming. Not just records, but causal connections. Patterns of altered trade routes converging into identifiable decisions. Names aligning with outcomes. And one name appearing more frequently than all others. Elias Crow. Alira inhaled slowly. Then she made a second decision. Not to stop the release, but to anchor it. If the system was cut externally, the truth would scatter. But if she could complete the final stabilization cycle, it would compile into a single coherent ledger. Undeniable, traceable, permanent. She turned to Merrick. "If I stabilize it," she said, "there won't be any fragments left to hide behind." Merrick understood immediately. "You'll make it permanent record," he said. She nodded. Below, Crow's voice rose again. "Last warning." Alira did not respond. Instead, she stepped fully into the lantern mechanism. The brass gears responded instantly now, as if recognizing completion rather than initiation. Light surged upward through the structure, no longer flickering but aligning. Merrick stepped back slightly. "This will expose everything," he said again, softer this time. Not warning her, confirming the consequence. Alira's voice was quiet. "That's the point." She turned the final stabilizing dial. The lighthouse responded like something exhaling after years of restraint. And then it spoke, not in sound, but in projection. Across the fog, above the rocks, across the harbor line beyond Black Marsh, the corrected ledger expanded outward in visible form. Ships, routes, dates, names, ownership chains, all rendered into undeniable sequence. Crow stepped back for the first time. Not because he was defeated, because the system he controlled no longer required his permission to exist. A silence fell below. Even the men with lanterns stopped moving. Because truth, once made visible at that scale, is not something that can be argued with in real time. It simply exists. And then, slowly, something unexpected happened. One of the harbor men lowered his lantern. Then another. A voice called out from the mist, uncertain, human. "My father was listed as lost at sea," someone said. "But he came back. They said he was never registered returning." Another voice followed. "So did mine." Alira felt it then. Not victory, not triumph, but release. Not of the system alone, but of the silence that had been enforced around it. Crow stood still as the projections continued to unfold around him, exposing years of controlled omission. He did not move for a long time. Then he looked up at the lighthouse, at Alira, and for the first time, there was no authority in his expression, only recognition that the structure he had used no longer obeyed him. Inside the lantern room, Merrick exhaled slowly. "It's done," he said. Alira did not answer immediately, because she was watching something else now. In the final layer of projection, her father's name appeared again, but not as an accusation. As a correction entry. Restored record. Tomas Venn, whistle system contributor. Removed under administrative suppression order. Cleared posthumously. Alira closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The lighthouse remained lit. But for the first time in its history, it was no longer hiding anything. The lighthouse did not dim after the revelation. It held its light steady, as though it had finally found a purpose it could sustain without shame. Below, the harbor men remained scattered across the rocks, lanterns lowered, their faces turned upward in uneasy silence. The projections still hovered in the fog. Ship routes, corrected manifests, names restored to places they had been erased from for years. But something subtle was changing in them now. They were settling, becoming final. Merrick noticed it first. "Elira," he said quietly, stepping closer to the control platform. "It's locking in." She opened her eyes. The lantern system was no longer merely projecting. It was compiling. The scattered truth was knitting itself into a single structured archive, no longer a pulse of exposure, but a permanent ledger anchored to Aldero Point. And that meant something irreversible had begun. Crow realized it at the same time. From the rocks below, his voice cut upward again, but it had changed. The command was gone. What remained was urgency edged with something closer to fear. "Shut it down," he called. "If that ledger finalizes, every trade contract tied to it becomes legally void. You'll destabilize the entire coast's economic chain." Elira looked down at him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, she replied, "Or we'll just stop pretending the cost was never paid." A ripple passed through the crowd below. Not rebellion yet, but recognition. The kind that begins when long-held certainty starts to fracture. Merrick turned toward her. "This is bigger than exposure now," he said carefully. "If it locks as a permanent registry, governments will respond. Ports will fight over legitimacy. Some will try to destroy the source." Elira's gaze remained fixed outward. "Then they'll have to come here," she said. That sentence changed the air again, not as threat, but as consequence. Aldero Point was no longer just a lighthouse. It was now a reference point for truth itself. And truth, once centralized, becomes target. The lantern system emitted a low, continuous resonance, like a tone too deep to be heard properly, but felled in the bones. The safe behind them clicked once more, as if acknowledging completion. Merrick glanced back at it. "There's still one unresolved file," he said. Elira turned. Inside the open safe, beneath the restored ledger, a final sealed document remained untouched. Unlike the others, it bore no classification marks, no ownership stamps, no corrections. Only a single handwritten line. Origin authorization. Elira stepped closer. Slowly, she opened it. The pages inside were thinner than the others, older in a way that felt less like age and more like origin. The handwriting was not her father's. It was older than him, possibly older than Crow. The document described the creation of Aldero Point System, not as a correction engine, but as an experimental maritime verification network designed to resolve disputes between competing port authorities by establishing a single uncontestable source of navigational truth. But over time, it had been repurposed, quietly, incrementally, until verification became control, and control became narrative authority over loss itself. At the bottom of the document, one line had been repeatedly signed over decades, layered like sediment. Elias Crow, authorization continuity holder. Elira felt something settle in her chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. She closed the document slowly. Below, Crow was still watching, waiting. He understood now that the structure he had defended was no longer interpretable in his favor. But what he did not yet know was what Elira would choose next, because she still held control of the lighthouse. And control, once acknowledged publicly, cannot simply be ignored. Maddox spoke softly. "If you leave it like this, it becomes a permanent public truth node," he said. "Every harbor that connects will be forced to reconcile their records. Some will comply. Some will resist." Elira nodded. "And my father's name stays cleared," she said. Maddox hesitated. "Yes." A pause. Then he added, "But it also means Crow will be exposed as the continuity holder." Silence followed that. Outside, Crow seemed to sense the shift. He called up once more, but this time his voice carried less authority and more warning. "You don't understand what happens when systems like this collapse," he said. "You think you're restoring justice. You're dismantling stability." Elira finally looked directly at him again, and when she spoke, it was not anger. It was clarity. Stability built on erased people isn't stability, she said. It's permission to forget. A long silence followed. Then very slowly, Crow stepped back, not retreating, reassessing, because even he now understood something had changed beyond his ability to reverse. Inside the lighthouse, the lantern light stabilized into a steady, coherent beam, not aimed outward, but distributed evenly across the horizon, as though refusing to privilege any single direction. Merrick watched it. It's no longer just a record, he said quietly. Elira nodded. It's a witness. And for the first time since she arrived at Alderaan Point, the lighthouse did not feel like a place of abandonment or secrecy. It felt like something that had finally stopped lying. The morning after the ledger stabilized, Black Marsh Harbor did not wake up in the usual way. There was no single moment of realization, no sudden announcement, no unified reaction. Instead, truth arrived like tidewater finding new channels, spreading through every conversation, every dockside exchange, every ledger book pulled open in confusion. Ships scheduled to arrive carried records that no longer matched port archives. Cargo declarations no longer agreed with insurance ledgers. Entire voyages had been quietly rewritten for years, and now, for the first time, the differences could not be ignored. From the lighthouse at Alderaan Point, Elira watched it unfold without moving from the lantern room. The beam remained steady, not projecting chaos, but revealing structure, like a patient hand lifting layers off an old painting. Merrick stood beside her, arms folded, listening to distant sounds carried faintly across water. Voices from the harbor, rising and falling in uneven waves. They're arguing already, he said quietly. Elira did not look away. They're comparing records. A pause. And realizing theirs don't agree, Merrick finished. Below them, on the rocks, the delegation had not left. Crow remained at the center of a small cluster of officials, though his posture had changed. He was no longer commanding the group. He was contained by it. And contained men become measured men. That was what Elira noticed first. He was waiting now, not for control to return, but for consequence to choose its shape. Merrick shifted slightly. There will be pressure from the port councils within hours, he said. They'll want the lighthouse sealed again, or controlled. Elira finally turned away from the glass. No, she said simply. Merrick studied her. No. She moved toward the central console where the lantern gears still rested in alignment. This isn't something you seal, she said. It's something you learn to live honestly beside. Then she added quieter, where you keep lying until it breaks again later. A long silence followed. In that silence, something unexpected happened. A bell sounded from the harbor. Not the lighthouse horn. A dock bell. Then another. And another. Madik frowned. That's the customs signal. Elira stepped closer to the glass. Below, movement had begun. Slow at first, then more coordinated. Harbor clerks were opening archived ledgers. Dock workers were carrying comparison sheets between old manifests and newly revealed records. Ships anchored offshore were being flagged for verification. Not panic. Adjustment. Crow noticed it too. He stepped forward from the group and looked up at the lighthouse again. And for the first time, his voice did not carry command when it came. It carried calculation. This will not hold, he called upward. Systems revert under pressure. You've only exposed discrepancies. You haven't resolved them. Elira answered immediately. Then we resolve them. That simple reply caused a shift below, because it reframed everything. Not collapse, not exposure. Process. Merrick looked at her sharply. You can't personally manage reconciliation for an entire coastal network. I don't have to, she said. The lighthouse does. She turned back to the mechanism. And for the first time since activation, she made a new adjustment. Not expansion, not exposure. Calibration. The lantern system responded differently this time. Less like an explosion of truth and more like organization. The projections refined themselves, grouping into categories. Confirmed voyages, disputed entries, missing reconciliations, unresolved ownership chains. A structure map of correction instead of overwhelming exposure. Below, someone in the harbor shouted, not in fear, but in recognition. It's sorting them. Another voice responded, stunned. It's matching the records. Madik exhaled slowly. You're turning it into an arbitration system. Elira nodded once. Truth without structure is just noise, she said. A pause. And noise doesn't fix anything. Crow's expression shifted again as he realized what she was doing. This was not destruction of his system. It was replacement. And worse, for him, it was more stable. Because stability anchored in transparency is harder to challenge than stability anchored in secrecy. He stepped back again, just slightly this time, not retreating from fear, from irrelevance. Inside the lighthouse, Merrick watched the lantern's refined projections settle into ordered lanes of information, each one aligning with a corresponding harbor node across the coast. You've decentralized it, he said slowly. Elira corrected him gently. I've made it readable. A quiet moment passed between them. Then Merrick said, almost carefully, and what happens to him? He did not need to name Crow. Elira understood. She looked down once more through the lantern glass. Crow stood still now, no longer issuing commands. Around him, the harbor officials had begun separating, not abandoning him, but distancing themselves as the structure of authority around him dissolved. He was still present, but no longer protected by ambiguity. Elira answered quietly. He answers to what he built, she said. And for the first time, Crow did not respond upward, because there was nothing left to command. Only records remaining to reconcile. The lighthouse beam remained steady across the horizon, no longer exposing truth as a shock, but holding it as a constant. And in that steadiness, Black Marsh Harbor began, unevenly, reluctantly, but unmistakably, to adjust to a world where nothing important could be erased anymore without leaving a trace. Understood, we can close it cleanly now instead of stretching further. Elira remained in the lighthouse as the days passed, not because she needed to control it anymore, but because she needed to understand what it had become without fear attached to it. The lantern no longer felt like a weapon or a secret. It felt like a ledger that finally told the truth without permission. Word eventually came from Black Marsh Harbor. Captain Elias Crow was removed quietly, not in spectacle, but in documentation. The same system he once used to erase others now recorded his authority as invalid under the restored registry. There were no celebrations about it, only correction. Elira did not go to watch it happen. Instead, she walked the edge of Aldero Point where the wind had once carried only silence. Now, it carried distant activity, ships being checked, records being aligned, voices no longer agreeing blindly with old papers. Merrick stayed for a short time after, helping formalize the lighthouse into a permanent coastal verification station. But he understood what Elira understood eventually, that she was not meant to belong to the system she restored. She was only meant to awaken it. When he left, he simply said, "You gave people something they didn't know they had lost." Elira did not answer immediately, because what she had really given them was the ability to be found again. Later, she climbed the lantern room one final time. The safe remained open, empty now except for dust and iron memory. The logs had been copied, distributed, and anchored into the coast's new record system. Nothing essential remained hidden. She placed her hand briefly on the brass frame. Not in ownership, and goodbye. Then she left the lighthouse door open behind her as she walked down the stone steps toward the coast. For the first time, Aldero Point did not feel like an ending place. It felt like a beginning that no longer needed secrecy to survive. And somewhere far behind her, the lighthouse kept shining, not to hide the truth, not to control it, but simply to remember it.